It's quite remarkable that we had the mayors of a number of Ukrainian cities, a lot of the government figures, many people in civil society coming all the way to Davos to basically try and persuade the West that they need to rally support around them.
Hello and welcome to the GZERO World podcast. This is where you'll find extended versions of my interviews on public television. I'm Ian Bremmer, and I'm coming to you today from the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Because of the pandemic, it's been 2 years since this gathering of public and private sector leaders took place. Needless to say, there was a lot to discuss. The theme this year, history at a turning point. As a war rages on the European continent, its cascading impact can be felt all over the world. I talk about that and more with some of the thought leaders at the forum. First up, Wolfgang Ischinger. He's a top German diplomat who served as chairman of the Munich Security Conference from 2008 to 2022. Let's do this.
The GZERO World podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more. GZERO World would also like to share a message from our friends at Foreign Policy. Challenge yourself to change the world. On Season 3 of Course Correction, a podcast from Doha Debates in partnership with the UNHCR Refugee Agency, host Nellifer Hedayet takes listeners on the journey of a refugee. From the moment of displacement to mental health risks to integration and assimilation, learn about the issues affecting displaced persons around the world and what you can do to solve them. Follow and listen to Course Correction wherever you get your podcasts.
With my friend Wolfgang Ischinger here at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Wolfgang, so state of transatlantic relations today from the Davos perspective, what do you think?
Good shape, better than at any time in recent memory. If we had had a Davos a year ago, we would have been talking about the debacle of Afghanistan, etc. We're in good shape now. NATO is essentially, on track. The European Union has surprisingly not fallen apart. My only concern is if it is correct to assume that this war in Ukraine will drag on for not weeks but months. Are we going to be in good shape 3, 6, 9 months down the road? That's my concern. Are we going to have the stamina to stay on course?
Now, question. To the extent that war fatigue is starting to set in over time, and again, I think most people presume this is not ending anytime soon.
Exactly.
Does it come first from the Europeans or from the Americans, and why?
Well, let's talk about America for a moment. You guys have elections coming up, midterm elections, and I'm not so certain that the average American voter is going to like the idea of paying higher gas prices and spending more money on foreign expeditions, etc., etc. So I'm worried a little bit about the American commitment, longer term. In Europe, I think at the moment we're in good shape, but of course we have these outliers. We have Viktor Orban,
Hungary.
We have Hungary, and we have a couple of other partners that have specific interests. Germany has its own problem with gas. I wish I could say in 6 weeks or in 12 weeks we're going to be able to cut gas imports from Russia. It's hard to do, and I feel sorry for those in my own government who have to respond to this urgent question from our Ukrainian partners. When are you going to stop financing the Russian war of aggression by continuing to buy this stuff? But then again, it's not going to help if Germany cuts gas imports now with the obvious consequence of a significant recession. Then, of course, the commitment by the German wider public for our Ukrainian, determination will surely shrink.
Yeah.
And whose interest would be served with that? So this is really a dilemma.
And the Americans and the Europeans have had divergent perspectives for a while on Russia that are now aligning. They've also had some divergent perspectives on China for a while.
Yeah.
Are they now aligning?
I think there is one lesson we are learning, we Europeans. We cannot ignore that the US is looking at a huge problem, potential problem with China, with the Taiwan issue, etc. And we cannot possibly leave the United States alone in that. In other words, we need to understand that even though this is many thousands of miles away, it is in our interest to get involved, maybe not militarily, we don't have the capacities militarily, but certainly politically. And we need much closer coordination between Washington and Brussels and Berlin and Paris on China.
And Olaf Scholz so far, when you saw that initial speech he gave, the turning point speech he gave, did it reflect for you a new strategic vision for Germany? Is this a new generation for Germany in politics, or is it more modest than that?
No, it is. It was a major decision. Look, essential elements of established German foreign policy went up the chimney.
We'd say out the window,
but
that sounds more definitive if it's up the chimney.
Out the window. The idea which we had been about which we had been preaching for many years, the future partnership with Russia, out the window, no longer possible. The idea of a security order for all of Europe, with Russia included, out the window. In other words, for no country has this Russian attack against Ukraine produced more sharp cuts and the need for total revision of our foreign policy. The problem for Olaf Scholz is not that he gave the wrong speech. The problem for him is that it's not so clear that all of his followers in his own party agree with his speech and with the consequences of spending 100 billion extra on defense and on meeting the 2% defense goal going forward, etc. So he has to fight this internal, political fight, not against the opposition, which supports him, but against his own party.
No, the Americans have been saying for a long time, how come the Europeans aren't sacrificing the Germans? The Europeans are sacrificing more this time around. There's no question.
Absolutely.
Wolfgang Ischinger, good to see you.
Thanks, Ian. Great to see you.
This year's World Economic Forum wasn't just about the many crises that we're facing. It was also a referendum on the forum itself and the strength of the multilateral values it defends. I talked about that with Venezuelan journalist Moises Naim. Here's our conversation.
Moises Naim, you always talk about power, and standing here in the World Economic Forum, I want to ask you, how much power do you think this group really has today, and how's it moving?
Well, it's always easy to overstate the power here and what happens. This is a meeting in which there is a lot of interactions, there's a lot of conversations, but it's not the center point in which decisions are made. The essence of power emanating of meetings like this has to do with ideas and the clarity of ideas. And the dominant feeling that I have gotten from the meeting that is confusion reigns. Confusion is the leitmotif of this meeting. People don't know what is happening. A very famous Spanish philosopher, José Ortega, said in 1939, he saw what was coming in Europe, and he said, we don't know what is happening to us, and that is exactly what is happening to us. And I think that captures very well the mood here, in which everybody feels and knows that there are these massive changes of uncertain consequences, and that then generates the anxiety, the doubts about everything, and that, of course, erodes power.
The last time there was this level of crisis at the World Economic Forum was 2009. It was right in the teeth of the global financial crisis. And people didn't necessarily know how we were going to come out of it, but they all knew what the tools were. They all understood the nature of the crisis. This time around, it feels very different. It's more diffuse, and they don't understand how to respond.
And it's more without precedent. The 2009 financial crisis came in the heels of many financial crises around the world. So the world was equipped with institutions and policies and ideas, as you say, how to deal with a financial collapse. That's not the case here. We are dealing with uncertain situations that have no precedent. And that also adds to the confusion that I just mentioned.
So if we look forward 5 years' time, where is the locus of power going to be that will surprise us? What institutions, what geographies?
In the future, power is will continue to be concentrated in algorithms and leaders and their followers. That triad is going to stay with us. What we don't know is what are the sectoral anchors of that or the geographical anchors. But artificial intelligence is going to have consequences for power, as will new kinds of leaders and new kinds of followers that expect and demand from their political leaders things that have not been common until now.
Now, do you think that continued development in artificial intelligence is necessarily a centralizing aspect, a consolidating aspect of power?
It's both. It's a technology, and all technologies are two double-edged swords. Technologies can be very good for some things and very bad for others. There's no doubt that artificial intelligence is going to be a technology that's going to touch all sectors and transform them in very surprising ways. And we're going to be surprised by the kinds of places where artificial intelligence will pop up, and this change completely what we knew about that place.
One other point, Latin America is virtually not on the agenda this year. It's part of the world you know very, very well. If you could insert Latin America on the agenda in a big way, what would you want to be discussed here?
The very dangerous convergence of inflation and disappointment with democracy. The world is going to face inflation for the first time in several decades, almost a generation. Yeah. We're living with a generation of people that don't know what inflation is, and inflation is coming. And it's coming at the same time that there is a lot of disappointment with the performance of democracy. And so that's a perfect storm to create nasty politics.
And which country that's a strong democracy right now might not be in a few years in Latin America?
I don't know.
You don't want to make an assessment there.
No.
Did you like the fact that the Americans were reaching out to the Venezuelans on the energy front?
I hope that something like that happens, but not in the way it's happening. I think it's being managed in a way that is haphazard, not well thought through, and ineffective. I hope that the current ways of thinking about how to deal with Venezuela at the White House, at the State Department, will be revised, reviewed, and tossed, and other ways of engaging will be found.
Good to see you, Moises.
Same here.
Finally, Gillian Tett chairs the editorial board at the Financial Times. She spent time meeting with the Ukrainian delegation here in Davos and shared with me some of what she learned.
Gillian Tett, last night you were with the entire Ukrainian delegation. An emotional time for you. Tell me what you took away from that meeting.
Well, the first thing I took away was the fact that the Ukrainians are being exceptionally clever in terms of trying to rally support in the West by coming here. I mean, it's quite remarkable that we had the mayors of a number of Ukrainian cities, a lot of the government figures, many people in civil society coming all the way to Davos to basically try and persuade the West that they need to rally support around them. And not just support them in terms of ending the war through sanctions and other measures and trying to get military support, but also very actively now thinking about rebuilding and about the Marshall Plan.
And I mean, Davos is not a place typically that you would expect to see a Ukrainian delegation rallying for support. They've gotten away with it because of the sheer brutality of the Russians, but also because of the trauma that is so evidently and abundantly being experienced by everyone in the delegation.
Well, I think what's very clear is listening to the stories about the horrific events happening on the ground in Ukraine, even as we speak, is injecting a level of emotion and shock into what's frankly normally often very dry and boring and wordy debates. And there's a huge amount of goodwill here. There's a huge recognition that what they're fighting for are values that Davos itself has often tried to proclaim or say that it espouses. There's also recognition that eventually there will be some kind of business opportunity in Ukraine for many people here, and they're looking about that as well. But in the short to medium term, the other issues, of course, are questions of food security, the questions around sanctions and how they're going to impact the global economy. And people are saying, yes, we absolutely support you, but there are also concerns we have.
Now, on the sanctions piece, something the Financial Times is surely very interested in. I mean, we have an awful lot of assets that are being confiscated, and there's a lot of talk about taking those assets and helping to pay off the Ukrainians who have just been invaded by Russia. I've heard a lot of people criticizing that on the sidelines of this global group. What's your take?
I've heard lots of concern about that as well, not just from American financiers and lawyers who say, what about the due process element of all this? You know, we want to have some kind of framework and due process, but also from the non-Western investors who have been investing in America or Europe in recent years are saying, well, hang on a sec, if due process is being overturned, what will it mean for us looking at America as an investment destination? Now, the Ukrainians are aware of this, and they've come up with a number of documents which are trying to create some kind of framework and due process around this, which they've been passing around to people in recent days. And it's going to be very interesting because there are a number of techniques and tools you can use that already exist under US law and in jurisdictions like France and Netherlands, which actually would allow you to do quite a lot of action right now. The question, though, is whether they're solid enough and whether the people in Davos will rally around any of the Ukrainian proposals around a due process.
So maybe, but what you're saying is we're not there yet.
Not there yet, and it's going to be very tough.
Gillian Tett.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World podcast. Like what you've heard? Come check us out at gzeromedia.com and sign up for our newsletter, Signal.
The GZERO World podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more. GZERO World would also like to share a message from our friends at Foreign Policy. Challenge yourself to change the world. On Season 3 of Course Correction, a podcast from Doha Debates in partnership with the UNHCR Refugee Agency, host Nelifer Hedayet takes listeners on the journey of a refugee. From the moment of displacement to mental health risks, to integration and assimilation, learn about the issues affecting displaced persons around the world and what you can do to solve them. Follow and listen to Course Correction wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.